Every day, before recording my show, I go over the script. Many people ask me, what exactly is written on this script? It's actually very simple. Let me show you. This is just an outline I write every day, before recording my show. Generally, after deciding on a topic for the day, I first look up some information online. Then, based on this information, I write a simple outline on paper. Usually, it ends up being 2 or 3 pages long, just like this. The content is roughly in the order I plan, like 1, 2, 3, 4. After I write it down, I form an impression in my mind. This way, when I speak, the order generally won't be too chaotic and I won't go off topic. If I forget something in the middle, I'll just take a quick look at this outline I wrote. When I first started doing this show, someone reminded me, they said, actually, Wang Jun, you could write a verbatim script. If you write a verbatim script, you can turn everything you want to say today into an article. And then you can use a teleprompter in front of you and read from the verbatim script. This way, your show might be more concise and streamlined. For example, if the show is currently 20 minutes long, you might be able to finish it in 10 or 12 minutes. This might make the listeners more efficient. I know about the verbatim script. When we worked at China Central Television, CCTV, our announcers were actually reading from a verbatim script. They were not allowed to improvise. They just read the script, like telling a story to everyone. When Hu Jintao came to power, Jiang Zemin helped him get started and supported him for a while. Jiang Zemin served as the chairman of the Central Military Commission for a few years. Later, after Hu Jintao had been the president for over a year, Jiang Zemin fully retired. On the day Hu Jintao completely took over power, the political phrase used was to unite around the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, with Hu Jintao at its core. The term core was first used in reference to Hu Jintao. On the day it was to be broadcast on the news, the announcer on duty was Luo Jing. However, something went wrong that day. Such an important script, the broadcast script, was lost. Because there were too many papers on the desk, they couldn't find it. When broadcasting this script, they kept searching and searching but couldn't find it. After searching and not finding it, you have to understand no one dares to improvise. It was played randomly. So in the end, the next piece of news was cut off. Finally, the news broadcast ended, and this piece of information was not aired. Afterwards, Hu Jintao's office even called China Central Television, CCTV. They said that no one should be held accountable for this matter. What I want to say is, what is the purpose of this story? Actually, many announcers at China Central Television, CCTV, use verbatim scripts. But the biggest problem with verbatim scripts, in my opinion, is that it is very difficult to establish a sense of communication between people. When you watch their presentation, you always feel like they are reading from a script. Of course, if you undergo very rigorous training, like the announcers and hosts who graduated from broadcasting schools, they have undergone very standardized and long-term training, which can reduce this sense of mechanical communication to a lower degree. But in reality, it's also completely impossible to reduce it to zero. So we call it the broadcast tone, meaning as soon as they start talking, you know it's the broadcast tone. It's unlikely to feel like a conversation between people. However, when I write a simple outline and start talking, of course there will be some filler words and unnecessary chatter, and the efficiency might be a bit lower. But a very important point is that it establishes a kind of communication interface between people. I believe this is more important than the accuracy brought by a verbatim script, because the sense of communication between people makes the speaker more credible. So, is it because of the sense of communication between people, it establishes not only the transmission of information, but more importantly, the transmission of emotions? What kind of person are you? Through your communication, a so-called image is established, and this is what I value more. Therefore, I am firmly against writing a verbatim script. I only write this so-called outline, and this outline is more than enough for me, completely sufficient. So, what topic are we going to talk about today? Today, I saw 2 pieces of news. One piece of news is that a large area of Beijing will be collectively relocated to that kind of place. Chongli in Hebei is going to be quarantined. The weather in Chongli, Hebei, is still quite cold right now because it's the place where the Winter Olympics were held. So I saw in the notice that it reminded everyone to bring warm clothes and such. Another piece of news is that Henan seems to be implementing nucleic acid testing for everyone. every other day. These two pieces of news, I want to talk about them together. What topic should I discuss? It's about observing the so-called epidemic prevention measures in the country over the past 2 years. These epidemic prevention methods are being increasingly intensified, becoming stricter and stricter. Think about it. Henan is conducting nucleic acid tests every 2 days. This is such a terrifying thing. And regardless of whether there is an outbreak in your area, you still have to get tested every 2 days. Personally, I am very afraid of these nucleic acid tests. When I first returned to China from Japan, my first nucleic acid test was in Japan. The testing agency in Japan might be very thorough, and when they swabbed my nose, they went really, really deep. That really long, just so long, cotton swab, when it was inserted, I immediately had tears streaming down my face. That feeling, you can't even imagine. I was instantly in tears, and it stayed in there for a while, and even stirred around a bit, you know? It was just too uncomfortable. I really couldn't bear it. Then the person had me turn to the other nostril after enduring for a while, sitting there waiting for a long time before testing the second one. I was traumatized by that nucleic acid test. But I just can't imagine having to take a nucleic acid test every 2 days. What will happen? Of course, although now it's not necessarily all nasal swabs, there are also throat swabs. Throat swabs might not be as painful, but think about it. Even if it's a throat swab, having someone come to test you for nucleic acid every 2 days, the disruption to your life is unimaginable. Right, so. This brings up a question. Many people ask, and I have also asked myself, they say, do you really love it when you return to the country? The country has implemented such intense, so-called epidemic prevention measures that, to people in other countries, these measures seem inhumane. Why don't people in the country resist? Why are they so compliant? You see, we often see photos of people getting nucleic acid tests at night, with long white lines that could stretch for kilometers. Everyone goes to get tested as soon as the community leaders give the order. Why is no one protesting? Why is no one opposing? Why is no one organizing to not cooperate? Actually, I have thought about this reasoning. When I returned to the country, I think most people have seen the Return to Hometown series, right? There are a total of 6 episodes of Return to Hometown. This Return to Hometown series, when I returned to the country, whether it was nucleic acid testing, quarantine, health code QR codes, or the inconvenience of travel, it was all extremely painful for me. Very, very painful. That's why I was able to document it in the form of Return to Hometown. I have noticed one particular thing. Anyone who has returned to the country from abroad and watches my show feels especially moved. Everyone can relate to that, like those quarantine QR codes and health codes. But many friends in the country, after watching, think it's very impressive. But they don't have the same deep understanding as those of us living abroad who return to the country. Why is that? I noticed a phenomenon when I returned to the country. My friends, relatives, and even colleagues in China feel much less pain from the domestic epidemic prevention measures than I do. They feel like it's not that unbearable. I wondered why this was happening. Later, I actually came to understand the reason. Their rights have gradually been lost. Do you remember what it was like at the beginning of the pandemic? Back then, it might not have been severe enough to require quarantine, right? Maybe they first gave you a health code, and after a few days, once the health code was done, they gave you a QR code. No, not this one, I mean the travel code, right? Then the travel code, and then they asked you to take a nucleic acid test, right? After the nucleic acid test, some people could be quarantined. And after quarantine, some went to the makeshift hospitals. Right? The process of losing these rights is gradual, not something that happens all at once. You know why we feel so uncomfortable when we return to the country? It's because we come back from a relatively free environment to the domestic environment, and the contrast between the two is particularly stark. But for people in the country, it's not the same. When his rights are gradually taken away, you will find that his tolerance is much stronger. In fact, this is a very important principle in social psychology. Humans have a very strong ability to adapt to their environment. They are the most adaptable animals among all species. From a certain perspective, humans are also the easiest animals to domesticate. If you look at the animal kingdom, the number of animals that can be domesticated is actually very, very small. Moreover, the domestication of animals that we now consider to be our helpers, such as pigs, cows, and horses, actually took a long time, a very long time, to domesticate them into animals that can work and live with us. However, domesticating humans is much easier than domesticating animals. Why is that? Because humans inherently have a strong ability to adapt to their environment. Very strong, or rather people's expectations. The ability to adapt to environmental changes is also very, very strong. During World War II, Germany established many concentration camps. These concentration camps have been extensively studied by later sociologists, and I have read some of these works. I found that initially, people were very unaccustomed to the concentration camps, but soon you would notice that within the camps, people began to live what seemed like relatively normal lives under those circumstances. For example, there are transactions, I quote, barbershops, and then parents organize their children to read and draw, right? There are even romantic relationships between men and women happening there. You will find that in a concentration camp, people's ability to adapt to the environment is incredibly strong. They are not thinking every day that they might die and what kind of life they want to live. It's not like that. What it means is that when you lower their expectations to a certain threshold, they will, in turn, develop a new sense of anticipation for life in that environment. Another example is Gao Xiaosong, who once talked about this in his show Xiaosongpedia. He told a story about this. When the Qing dynasty first defeated the Ming dynasty, everyone knew that they had to cut their hair, shave their heads, and change their clothes. Shaving their heads meant getting rid of the traditional Chinese habit of tying up their hair, and instead braiding it like the Manchus. At the beginning, this was met with great resistance in China, especially in southern society. There was very, very strong resistance. So everyone knows that the 10 days of Yangzhou and the 3 massacres of Jiading were very important because of the so-called hair shaving and clothing change. People had to wear the Manchu attire, and we Chinese were not allowed to wear our original clothing. Men had to braid their hair in a specific way. Therefore, many people in various places risked their lives to resist. However, 50 years after the Qing dynasty had ruled over the Ming dynasty, when Korean envoys went to China to pay tribute, the common people on the roadside would laugh at them. Why? Because the Korean envoys were still wearing the clothes that the Chinese people wore during the Ming dynasty, but the people of the Qing dynasty no longer wore those clothes. These clothes were only preserved in Korea. In opera works, that is to say, the actors still wear them. So at that time, when they saw the Korean envoys coming to Beijing to pay tribute, they said, "Look, the Korean envoys are dressed just like the actors in the opera." They quickly forgot. This was actually the clothing of their own ancestors. Then history continued to develop. By the time the Qing dynasty was about to collapse, everyone knew about simplified characters, but many people were not used to them, including many Han Chinese. In one of his works, Lu Xun wrote about a character who, after entering the city once, had his queue, braid, cut off, and returned home crying bitterly, feeling as if his life was over. Right. Why? Because he had already gotten used to it. This shows how strong people's ability to adapt to their environment is, which is something you can hardly imagine. So this can indeed explain why people within our borders seem indifferent to such high-pressure, so-called defense measures. I think this is a very important principle. For example, the disinfection process when entering a place, right? A few days ago, I did a show about some legal scholars. That comrade contacted some legal scholars to protest, saying that this clearly violates the law, and that the law has never authorized such actions. But you'll find that the general public is quite cooperative with this. So the next question naturally arises. Why are legal scholars so sensitive to these infringements on rights? And what about ordinary people? Are they not sensitive? Personally, I think that legal scholars have an inner compass. What is this compass? It's the rules of law. They know what crosses the line and what doesn't. Ordinary people, on the other hand, rely on their own feelings to judge whether they should cooperate with the government, unless the pressure test crosses the line and exceeds their tolerance. Then they might erupt and resist, but as long as it is within their tolerance range, ordinary people might just endure. These so-called high-pressure defense measures, amazing after a few complaints, At most, there might be a small-scale conflict, but once they subdue you, that's it. Most people will cooperate. This is the reality in China. What topic do I want to extend this to? It's that some time ago, during a live broadcast, just last Saturday during the live broadcast, I answered a question. I said something when answering that question, which was why I am not willing to shout slogans like many overseas independent media. I said something. I said, do you know what they are afraid of? They are not afraid of you opposing them. They are afraid of you reasoning and telling the truth. Actually, I think this principle was answered a long time ago by Mr. Lu Xun. Everyone has read the novel by Mr. Lu Xun, right? It was part of our middle school curriculum, wasn't it? The revolutionary Xia Yu was determined to carry out the revolution, saying that the Qing dynasty's world belonged to everyone. But Huang Laoshuan was focused on getting medical treatment for his son, constantly thinking about buying a steamed bun soaked in human blood. When Xia Yu was sent to the execution ground, he was still shouting revolutionary slogans. Everyone was discussing and saying that this person had gone mad. How could he shout like that? The Qing dynasty's world belongs to everyone, doesn't it? So, isn't it sealed? Right? Therefore, the social reality that Mr. Lu Xun pointed out in this novel, I believe, still holds significant relevance even today. In other words, if the public itself has an unclear understanding of the boundaries of power and the awareness of power, then your opposition, or anyone else's opposition, will be meaningless to them. It might even scare them away. For example, when it rains and they shout those slogans, it scares away all the fancy decorations, right? All they can think of is using human blood buns to cure their son's tuberculosis, and that's it. Do you think shouting those slogans in the rain has any meaning for them? Not at all. So in that article, Mr. Lu Xun profoundly pointed out that the principle I am talking about is the same. Only awakening can save this society. So, how should we go about awakening people? For me, it's about reasoning and telling the truth. By reasoning and telling the truth, you can gradually help the public understand where the issues lie. Why is it not okay to enter homes for disinfection? Which law does it violate? These laws are made by you, but you also need to follow them, right? Right. So, regarding the current preventive measures, for example, the so-called nucleic acid testing every 2 days, what is the legal basis for this? Is there any legal authorization for this? Right. If there is no legal basis, we need to point it out and let the public know. Even if the public cannot directly oppose or resist the government right now, they should know that such actions are not legally authorized and might be arbitrary. So, for example, if they randomly relocate an entire community to Chongli, we need to ask, what is the legal basis for this? Right. Is there a scientific necessity for this? Is there a necessity for this in terms of public health and epidemic prevention? As we continue to explain these principles, ordinary people might gradually become aware. That's what I think. So, many people say, oh, Wang Jun, talking about these. Laws and such is useless. Isn't it a law-based society domestically? I say, whether it's useful or not, I have to talk about it because the laws are made by them. They make the laws, but they don't even enforce them. I want to tell the general public about this. The general public will say, look, isn't this the law you made? You should enforce it. I want them to know that even though they make the laws, they don't enforce them. Once the public knows this, it will gradually become a force for public awakening. This is truly how I feel inside, and I really hope to promote this through my show. So I have always said that the reason I am not willing to play along with many people's slogans is not because I am mild-mannered, but I think that's useless. I believe Mr. Lu Xun told me this truth almost 100 years ago, and I am willing to practice it. I hope to use my own small, insignificant power to gradually awaken the public, even if it's just 10 people, even if it's 100 people. Personally, I feel that if I can do that, I will have made my contribution to the progress and development of Chinese society. All right, that's all for today. Thank you, everyone. Let's continue our discussion tomorrow. Today, after finishing the recording, I realized that there was a point I didn't fully explain, so I'm coming back to say a few words. You might have noticed that during the pandemic, some communities were locked down for half a month or 20 days. When they reopened, many people were overjoyed, beating drums, and even dancing. Many people from abroad would say, look, They made you suffer so much, and then when they let you out, you still thank the government and the party, and you're so happy. Isn't that foolish? Actually, let me tell you, from a psychological perspective, this is very normal. Because human psychology, human happiness, doesn't depend on what you get, but on whether what you get meets your expectations. So, what does it mean when someone's situation worsens and their rights are reduced? It means that when they regain a little bit of freedom on this basis, they feel satisfied. It will be very, very satisfying. So you see, in many places across the country, after the lockdowns were lifted, the genuine happiness and joy that people felt were real, not fake. Moreover, I personally think that you can't call it cheap, it's just social psychology. For example, when I returned to the country, why did I go to great lengths to find a hotel that could order takeout? When I knew I had to be quarantined and lose my freedom for half a month, ordering takeout became a huge source of happiness for me. Normally, ordering takeout from a regular hotel doesn't make much difference. But in a quarantine hotel, whether you can order takeout or not is extremely important, at least for me. So, do you see, a person's sense of happiness has nothing to do with how much they actually get. And this is related to expectation management. So did you notice? A clever ruler will gradually reduce your rights while appropriately giving you some benefits. This kind of expectation management can make every ordinary person feel a sense of happiness, even as their rights are gradually being taken away. At this time, we should not blame every citizen who feels elated during the lifting of the lockdown, but rather the owners of the power who created this logic. The reasoning is clear here. Well, this is really the end for today. Let's continue our discussion tomorrow.